Well, joining me to talk about everything that happened over in Lithuania this past week with President Biden, NATO, Ukraine, is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He's an expert and the senior director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Admiral Montgomery, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. How are you, sir?
Thank you for having me today.
It's great to talk to you because there was obviously a lot packed into these few days over in Lithuania. And I'd like to start with Ukraine and the commitment that it appears G7 member states are willing to give to Ukraine, kind of an unprecedented amount of support that they're willing to give Ukraine as they fight off this Russian aggression. Can you just talk a little bit about what it is that the United States and our NATO allies have agreed to do to secure Russia's defense? I'm sorry, Ukraine's defense, not Russia's defense. Sorry.
Yeah. No, thanks. Good correction. So look, we've done a lot. The United States has done a lot. Our European partners have done a lot. Japan's done a lot. Another G7 country. Basically, we tend to talk about the military assistance. And the United States is, $40 billion or so into assistance to Ukraine. We're about $2 for every $1 of Europe in that kind of money and military money. If you flip it and look at humanitarian money, it reverses. It's about 2-to-1 European dollars and Japanese dollars to American dollars. So that makes sense. I like being the ones giving the military dollars. It means they're getting U.S. military equipment. Just as an aside, I would say, the United States Army's never looked newer than it does today because they have passed every aging Javelin, Stinger, HIMARS, guided missile launcher rocket to the Ukrainians who've used them successfully in combat and are now procuring new ones with that Ukrainian assistance money from U.S. Contractor, factories and spread throughout the United States. And so there are some benefits to this for the United States, but broadly, this is about arming Ukraine to hold, to fight off the illegal Russian invasion. So what I'd say is it's a significant amount of military assistance, humanitarian assistance, and then the beginnings of financial or economic assistance, because the amount of damage Russia has done to the Ukrainian economy is actually dwarfs the kind of spending we've done now on military and humanitarian assistance. I think it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars minimum. And Europe is starting to think about how they're going to handle that over the next decade, as whenever these hostilities end and we begin to rebuild the Ukrainian economy.
Now, NATO countries stopped short of admitting Ukraine into NATO for obvious reasons, right? I mean, if you do that, then essentially NATO is at war with Russia, and that requires a whole different level of commitment from the G7 countries, the United States, and all of that. But can you describe some of the reluctance, and flesh that out a little bit for folks who basically look at all of this assistance that we're going to be giving Ukraine and say we're essentially treating them as if they're a NATO country with the level of help that we're going to be giving them in terms of, like you said, humanitarian, rebuilding the economy and the military. What's the difference? Why can't we take that extra step right now?
So I think they reached a pretty good middle ground here. So, I mean, obviously they could have offered NATO membership right at the moment, or they could have said, you're going to have to go through the normal, traditional, what's called military action plan, half a decade long process that most of the Eastern European countries went through. Instead, what they were told is we're going to throw out the military action plan, but we're not going to start your membership timeline today. Instead, we're going to give you a series of renewed security guarantees about how we'll support you today and how we'll support you if Russia were to reinitiate hostilities after this conflict is over. So they have strong security guarantees, and they have a quick path to NATO membership once the hostilities are over. And I think I think they struck the right kind of warm porridge answer there, because either of the other two would have been a very tough thing. Having them join NATO while in conflict, there's a question of, does that just trigger Article 5 where all of NATO's in the conflict with troops on the ground, which is not something everyone was willing to accept. But making them go through a military action plan would have said after hostilities are over, and considering what the economy would have looked like and the military would have looked like after combat, it could have been 5 to 10 years. So I think they'll get an accelerated NATO membership after hostilities end. And that's one of the ways that we guarantee against a further Russian invasion at some future date.
What is your take on the White House's decision to give Ukraine these cluster bomb munitions?
Well, listen, I think the White House has eventually given Ukraine everything it needs. The problem is the word eventually. I mean, they do this in an extremely iterative, slow process. So they were slow to deliver the guided missile launcher rounds, the extended range artillery. They were slow to deliver the tanks, which unlocked the European tanks coming. And it's really European tanks that are involved in the counteroffensive right now, almost 200 of them. They were slow to really allow the spigot on the F-16. They have not allowed the ATACMS, which is the long-range artillery, which is absolutely crucial to Ukraine right now. They could use it desperately in this counteroffensive. And they were slow on this cluster munitions. And I know it must have really torn at them to give it. I mean, historically, Democratic administrations have been more opposed to cluster munitions than Republican. Look, they need the cluster munitions to break up the heavily entrenched Russian positions because we don't have sufficient amounts of 155 millimeter ammunition, or even the kind of howitzers. I mean, the guns to fire them. So the cluster munitions will help loosen up the Russian dug-in forces when the Ukrainians eventually find the salient they want and kind of drive to break the Russian forces in half between their southern and eastern invasion forces. And one other thing I'll say about them is that the percentages you see used about cluster munition dud rates are extremely dubious. To use the dud rates from Laos and Cambodia 50 years ago is inappropriate, and to use the dud rates from Russian weapons is inappropriate. You should use the dud rates from U.S. weapons testing and manufacturers. And I think it may not be as low as the under 2% they claim, but it's more in the 4 to 6% rate. What it's not is the 40% rate that you hear parroted around by opponents of this decision. These are needed. The battlefield will be cleaned up. There's tons of unexploded ordnance. It's much larger, already all spread all over Ukraine. We're going to have a massive cleanup anyway. Let's give them the weapon they need to breach the Russian forces, develop the salient, and drive through and put a significant tactical defeat on the Russian army.
So how do you think Russia is responding to this? All of the guarantees that the Western nations are agreeing to give to Ukraine. It seems pretty clear Russia is dealing not just with Ukraine, but dealing with all of NATO. How do they view their the NATO's reluctance to bring Ukraine into the fold now, but at the same time, like you said, this middle ground where Russia now can see that the West is going to be behind Ukraine for as long as this takes?
Yeah. If there's any sense of self-awareness in Russia, I mean, Putin has to understand he completely screwed up. I mean, in this regard, he was conducting a successful gray zone operation against Ukraine over the last decade. He was able, with little green men, to seize Crimea. He seized 20+% of eastern Ukraine in the Donbass regions. And for whatever reason, he decided to turn this into a kinetic conflict. And in the meantime, he's driven Finland and Sweden into NATO. He's he has spurred the increase in defense spending like nothing that President Obama, President Trump, or President Biden could convince our European partners to do, despite serious efforts, particularly by President Trump. And he's forced us to provide the 40 billion of U.S. and 20 billion of European equipment into Ukraine. It's broken the back of his army. It's revealed the weaknesses in the logistics of his overall military effort. It's depleted his cruise and ballistic missiles. I mean, in every possible way, shape, or form, this has revealed the kind of like the corruption and the failure and the morbidity in the Russian state. And so, I would have to say he doesn't feel pretty good. Now, he's not self-aware, so he's probably sitting back, apparently having lunch with Prigozhin, who ran a mini coup 2 weeks ago. I mean, logic is not the coin of the realm in the Russian Empire right now.
Last question for you here, sir. We also saw Turkey drop their opposition to Sweden being allowed into NATO. So after decades of neutrality, it appears Sweden will officially become a member. Why did Turkey decide to do this 180?
So Sweden, I think Turkey is a very transactional. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, is a very transactional leader, and he saw the opportunity. He saw the opportunity to get things like the F-16 deal from the United States, which he desperately needs after screwing up the F-35 deal when he bought the SA-400s. He saw an opportunity to get Sweden to take a tougher stance towards the Kurdistan, any kind of supposed terrorist activity in Kurdistan, and to get relieve some pressure on his European Union bid. So once he'd gotten enough in the transactional benefit plan, he agreed to this. Now, be careful. He agreed to have his parliament look at it in October. So for the next 3 to 4 months, he's going to get an opportunity to see, does Senator Menendez allow the F-16? He's the head of the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Does he allow the F-16 sale to go through? He's going to get a chance to see how Sweden continues to deal with the Kurds. He gets to see how the European Union, treats Turkish membership. But then there'll be a vote in October, and I think Sweden will be a full member of NATO. I think the Hungarian one was just a lesser included. That'll clear before the Turkish vote. So I'm comfortable that this was a transactional deal. He got what he felt was the maximum he could get, for his releasing, his hold on Sweden, and then he executed the deal.
Well, it's a really, really interesting time right now with NATO in this area of the world, and I know you've been writing a lot about it. How can people find your work over at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, Rear Admiral Montgomery?
Thanks. So myself, Brad Bowman, Ryan Probst, John Hardy particularly have been writing. John Hardy puts out something almost every week. We're at www.fdd.org. And you can see all of our writing there. But I particularly keep an eye out for John Hardy and his writing on Ukraine each week.
Well, Rear Admiral Montgomery, I really appreciate your time, your expertise that you brought to us today. Thank you so much for being on the DC Debrief. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.